Welcome back to Orlando Matters. One pastor in Lake County is hoping that a bill passes and Governor Scott signs it into law. It's all about what they're calling the Pastor Protection Act. And that pastor's even started a petition to make sure it goes forward. He spoke with Fox 35's Tom Johnson about it. Here's their story.
Pastor Chris Walker says he was called to the ministry at 17, but for the last 12 years, he's preached to congregations in warehouses or school auditoriums. You might not have known him or his cathedral of power if you were not a member, but that is changing. For the first time, he's in a real church building in Claremont, and more people are coming.
The people love it now, and got a lot of visitors coming and a lot of new families that are coming.
But things really started to change quickly, and people started really getting to know who Pastor Walker and his little church are when he went online last week and posted this petition at change.org.
The petition urges Florida Governor Rick Scott to sign the Pastor Protection Act if Florida lawmakers pass it. More than 14,000 signatures in its first week. The proposal it supports would shield pastors from civil suits if they refuse to perform same-sex marriage.
The church wants to have certainty through state law that we will be protected for our First Amendment rights.
Pastor Walker wants to be clear, though, the petition is not about same-sex marriage rights.
The courts have already decided that.
He says it's about his rights to his beliefs.
Marry who you want, but let us have the right to have our beliefs and have them protected.
Protected to preach here or anywhere else. Tom Johnson, Fox 35 News.
Joining me today to discuss it is Guillermo Smith. He is the Government Affairs Manager with Equality Florida. Good to see you. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me, John.
Now, we had a pastor in a couple of weeks ago to talk about this issue,
Absolutely.
And now's your chance. Your thoughts on the Pastor Protection Act?
Well, let's talk about the United States Constitution and what it says about freedom of religion. No pastor or house of worship can be compelled for any reason to marry any couple that they don't want to. No exceptions, period. That is their religious right. The Supreme Court ruling that came down that reaffirms the freedom to marry in June explicitly acknowledges that right and does not abridge their freedom to solemnize or not solemnize any wedding. What this bill is really about is it's trying to address an invented problem that doesn't exist. The bill sponsor has actually been here in your studio and has acknowledged that the problem doesn't exist. So where we are is that we know what the motivation behind the bill is. The bill is meant to be a simple disapproval of same-sex relationships. Not only does it perpetuate homophobia, but it also stigmatizes gay people. It certainly moves Florida in the wrong direction. But on top of that, it's very misleading because it makes the public and religious leaders think that they need protection that doesn't already exist in the First Amendment of the Constitution.
I think one of their concerns is the case that happened out on the West Coast where a company said we're not going to make the cake. We all remember that story, and then they got in big trouble for not making a cake for a same-sex marriage. Do you think that that's valid in this case? They say, wait a second, you said it couldn't happen in private enterprise or public enterprise. We're worried about what it's going to do in our business too.
Well, what the bill sponsor keeps saying is that this bill is just about solemnizing or not solemnizing weddings. But today, we're talking about pastors and we're talking about houses of worship. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about businesses that serve the public. Then we're going to be talking about government employees who are going to use a bill like this as an excuse to discriminate against anyone for any reason. That's why this bill is really a Trojan horse, because this bill has the potential to bring Indiana-style discrimination to the state of Florida. And that's why lawmakers should reject it immediately, because Florida is a place where discrimination should not be tolerated.
Okay, you said it's kind of a bill in search of a problem that doesn't exist, right?
It's an invented problem.
What do you use the word Trojan horse? What do you think the real reason for this bill is if it's not really going to accomplish anything?
Well, I think what it really is it's a intentional distraction from the real and urgent need to protect Floridians who really need it. Right now, it is totally legal in the state of Florida to discriminate and not either hire or fire someone based on them being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. There are no anti-discrimination protections in employment, in public accommodations, in housing. This bill is meant to be an intentional diversion diversion from a bipartisan bill that does bring non-discrimination protections to our state that actually has traction. So lawmakers, the adults in the room, need to reject this as something that has been cooked up by the far right, really just to score points with conservative voters. It doesn't address a real problem, and it should be rejected immediately.
And you say this legislature that's doing this right now has a history of doing these types of things. I'll let you explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this legislature cannot be trusted on LGBT issues. Just this last session, where the Florida legislature wasn't able to get anything done. They weren't able to pass a budget. They weren't able to pass medical marijuana reform. They weren't able to address a long list of Florida's problems. What they were able to do was they literally sat around all session and looked for ways, new ways, to discriminate against gay people. Second day of legislative session, a bill was heard in a House committee that made it a crime for a transgender person to use a public restroom. Also later in session, there was another bill that re-enshrined adoption discrimination into statute and allowed for state-sanctioned adoption agencies that receive taxpayer funds to deny child placement services to LGBT couples and interracial couples and interfaith couples simply because it aligned with their freedom of religion. This legislature can't be trusted on these types of issues.
Now, this is probably going to be a big election year issue, too. You're running for State House, right? Make sure I got
House
that
District
right.
49.
Do you think this will be a big issue in your district? Because you have a young district. We talked about this, one of the youngest in the state of Florida, and the younger people much more accepting of gay marriage. Do you foresee this being an issue in the upcoming election for you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what young voters and what actually a supermajority of Florida voters now believe is that marriage equality is fair, that gay couples absolutely deserve the right to marry who they love. But what they also agree with, polls have shown, a recent poll that came out from the Bob Graham Center for Public Service showed that in the state of Florida, 73% of Floridians believe that LGBT persons should not be discriminated against in housing, employment, and in public accommodations. So we know that the voters are on our side, and Republicans need to get right on this. Otherwise, they are going to be seen as the archaic and just kind of disconnected party that they've been on social issues.
So the bill has been filed. Like I said, we had the pastor in and the bill sponsor the other day. Where do you go from here now that the bill has already been filed?
Well, I think what we're going to see is lots of religious leaders from around the state are actually standing up in opposition to this bill. Just this last Sunday, an op-ed was written in the Orlando Sentinel by Pastor Brant Copeland from the First Presbyterian Church of Tallahassee, and he outlined his opposition to the bill as well as the opposition of many faith leaders. So we're going to find very early on that this really is a political game that is meant to distract voters from the real issue, and the adults in the room in the Florida legislature are going to reject this bill.
All right, Guillermo Smith, Government Affairs Manager with Equality Florida. What's your website in case people want to check you out?
It's www.carlosguillermosmith.com.
Always good to see you. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, John.
We will be back to wrap up the show right after this here on Orlando Matters on your Saturday morning.